right. CRPN Central, this is Dr. Fox. Please like, comment, subscribe. It helps the mission more than you know so that I can do more for you. Seriously, subscribe to CRPN Central on YouTube. It helps a lot. We're at 290 subscribers now. We're getting up there. And for every single one of you who are supporting me, I really appreciate it. And I want to bring it all back to you. Today, we have a very, very special event. We're going to start talking about acquisitions, a follow-up to a CRPN podcast that we had released just before December, just before the holidays. We're going to have a follow-up with that. Coming onto the stage right now is Mr. Carlos Orantes. Carlos, how are you doing, sir?
I'm doing well, Dr. Fox. Good to see you again, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. It was December when we talked. Seems like a hot second, but now we are back. Carlos, for all of the people who don't know Carlos, which if you've ever been to a conference, you know Carlos. I know we know Carlos. And for those of the folks that didn't hear the podcast, where you did an amazing job, and actually they don't know the full unedited cut of your introduction because we had to make time. Would you be willing to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. No, so my name's Carlos Orantes, as Dr. Fox said. I have the privilege to be leading Alcanza Clinical Research. We're a relatively new site network. We just celebrated our third birthday on December 21st, 2024. We're comprised of 12 different companies that we've gone through partnerships. We call them partnerships, acquisitions, over the past 3 years, and roughly about 450 strong team members around the country, including Puerto Rico. So we're, growing carefully and working through a lot of exciting times, changes, integrations, all the buzzwords that I'm sure we'll touch on today. But for me, it's more about the people and what we do each and every day. And last but not least, our name Alcanza, it means reach, which is what we're trying to do each and every day. Reach all the patients, participants around each of our sites that should know about research, should have access to research. So it's clinical research for all. So that's who I am.
That was my favorite part about the interview, Carlos. You know how I feel about research deserts, and you know that if a patient is qualified to be in a trial, I truly believe they should have access to it. And so for that reason, I'm very passionate about what Alcanza is doing for our communities, especially the folks in the communities who don't have access to research right now, who really need it. And I mean, really need it. I wonder, Alcanza's been going at this for a while. Have you ever had like those testimonials where someone says, "Oh my gosh, thank you so much for making this a part of our community. Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to participate." Have you ever heard anything like that?
Well, it's a lot of different things that we hear, Dr. Fox, some including we weren't aware of research, and now we are. And that's always a curiosity, is how long have you lived in this area and you didn't know about research? Others is I didn't have access to healthcare, and participating in this study, I learned some not so good news through a screening process, but it actually saved my life. So there's numerous stories like that, and they give you chills when you hear them. But it just reinforces to not just to me, but every single one of our team members that what we do truly matters.
I agree completely. Research for all. Absolutely. So Carlos, admittedly, Devora Henderson, our other guest, is not yet here, everyone. So I'm going to keep an eye on the stage. When Devora gets in, we'll bring her in. But for all of those who are watching right now, I want to be respectful of your time, and I want to make sure that we continue this conversation. So Carlos, I've known you for years now. And I remember last SCRS, I said, "Carlos, it's about darn time. We got to get you on the podcast. Let's do that." And then we got it. We did it in 2024. I met my 2024 objective. I successfully got Carlos Orantes onto CRPN Central. I'm so very thankful. So while we're waiting for Devora, I wonder, how did you feel about the CRPN Central experience as a guest?
I think it was, first of all, talking through it, the time flew by. I think when we're in this industry and we get a chance to talk about it, all the exciting things, all the challenges that we face, time flies. And that's what was amazing to me, is we talked for quite a bit of time. And like you said, when I heard the transcript, a lot of it had to be shortened, right? Because we didn't have a whole lot of time to piece it together. And so it just goes back to thinking about how much we have to deal with in this industry, the challenges and hurdles that we face each and every day, yet we continue to make progress as a community. And I think that's the biggest thing that, again, it reminded me how much collaboration it's actually going on each and every day here between, vendor partners, between whether it's service providers, whether it's research sites with other research sites, even though we're competitors, we're really collaborators. All of us are. And, the comment that I made to you before is I truly believe in rising tides will lift all boats. And we need to continue doing that.
Yes, I agree. I agree completely. And that's actually one thing that you and our other guest had in common. So, hi, Devora. I didn't mean to scare you there.
That's
Hi,
okay.
how are you, Devora?
I'm good. How are you? Can you hear me
Good.
okay?
Yeah, I can hear you, see you. Thank you so much for coming.
I apologize for
Carlos,
being late.
Carlos just introduced herself. So, Devora Henderson, would you be willing to introduce yourself to the folks at CRPN Central who are watching?
Sure. My name is Devora Henderson, and I am the CEO of Elevate Clinical Research, a new organization that started really in 2024. I had another site network previously called Syntech Studies, and I sold to private equity back in 2019. And so this is my second go around.
Wow. So a lot of lessons learned. Second go around, doing things differently, or
Yep,
still just as
it.
exciting, I'm sure.
Yeah, you know what to do on the second time, what not to do, right?
Yep. Lessons learned. So Devora, I asked Carlos this, and I wanted to ask you this. How did you feel about the experience of being a guest on CRPN Central? Like, what did you think of the process?
I thought it was really easy, and I thought you did a great job with the videos, and I couldn't be happier about it. I thought it was a good experience all the way around.
Well, thank you, and that's always wonderful to hear as a podcast person, and to have such superstars coming onto the podcast for me is a true honor. So, to Carlos and Devora, on behalf of the CRPN Central community, seriously, thank you so much for coming on to this podcast. This is a podcast dedicated to empowering our community sites with the information that they need so they can better serve their patients. And what better topic than acquisitions? Before this podcast, have you ever seen? What are the resources that sites have to talk about acquisitions and site sales and things like that? I mean, when I was doing this, I was looking for the podcast. I didn't see a lot of information. I think I saw SCRS. They did a really cool workshop on it, but it's not very full of information out there. Do you know of any resources for our sites?
No, I think what I've seen time and time again is sessions at conferences like SCRS or maybe some other medical conferences, and it's really hard because if you're not there, then how do you have access to this information? And not all people that are interested in this or pursuing this option may be at the conference, and even if they are, they may not be able to go to those. So I think this is an area where I think we need to do more as a community to help inform all of our potential partners out there.
Yeah. And what about you, Devora, from the site side? What do you think?
Yeah.
Any information for the sites they could look at?
I would tend to agree. I mean, the only thing that I've really seen is SCRS, and I mean that's about it, really.
Yeah. So maybe if anyone out there, if any sites looking to sell a site, maybe this can be a helpful resource for them so they would know where to look for. They can give Carlos or Devora a call, say, hey, I saw this podcast. I had a few follow-up questions. If you two are okay with that, I'd like to invite anyone watching, to reach out. Carlos and Devora are both amazing individuals, and they're very helpful in this community.
Absolutely.
Happy to do that.
Happy to do that. All right. So let's go ahead and let's dive in. So we had a really cool podcast about a month ago on acquisitions. Devora, you have successfully sold a site to private equity. Carlos, you are a network working within the private equity field, and you actually buy sites, right? You go through acquisitions. So we have so much knowledge, so much voice right here as we're talking that I really want everyone to have an opportunity to ask your questions. So if you are listening in right now, please feel free to type in a question. Let's ask Devora and Carlos. And while we're waiting for the guests to start typing questions, let's start talking about comparisons. So given your different perspectives, when you heard the podcast, did you have any like, oh, wow, that's an interesting perspective from this other person? Did you have any of those realizations, like I never thought of it that way, or things like that?
As far as like what he said, is that what you mean?
Versus what you said, versus opinions, versus anything like that.
I think we were pretty aligned actually on how it all goes down. I was happy to hear that we had so much alignment for sure.
Yep. I think the number one thing is accruals. Let's just pull that out right now. Accrual based accounting is the one thing that we find. So do we know, why do we think, or Carlos, from your experience, why do you think that sites fall into cash accrual, or they fall into cash, but then, I mean, what's the evolution of cash to accrual based accounting, and why don't sites just do that automatically?
Well, I think there's probably two reasons that we're told, because I asked that question, is why are you still on a cash basis? For one thing is for taxes, the other one is for revenue generation. Cash basis, it's easier, and some folks also from a tax perspective, they rather do it on a cash basis because then they don't want to be paying taxes on cash they haven't received. And in order to do accrual basis for revenue generation, you need a sophisticated system or tracking purposes. So there's just a lot more moving parts. That's the feedback that we've gotten. And so that's why when you go through the conversion process, you've got to put some elbow grease in to get it done. And, once it's up and running, it's easier to maintain.
And coming from someone who went from cash to accrual, Devora, what were like the culture shocks that you had to go through when you'd made that conversion, that transition?
Well, I had used just a normal bookkeeper, and that just wasn't one of their skill sets in order to do accrual accounting. And so it really was having to get somebody on a higher level that was aware of how to do that. And it was definitely a learning for me on what did that actually mean to be cash or accrual, because I didn't truly understand. And then at that time I didn't truly understand really how much revenue is sitting out there, or maybe that it was just done, we didn't code it the correct way in our CTMS or whatever. It should have been written off or what have you. So it just gave me a keener eye on what all was going on with the revenue and in general.
And so, Carlos, accrual-based accounting is 100% a little more accurate on your revenue and revenue generation, your AR. And so why is that important in the world of acquisitions? My knee-jerk guess is it has an influence on the EBITDA. But
that's correct. I think what we're looking at is how much revenue what's the value, the economic value of the activity being done at the time, regardless of when you collect the money. Clearly, from an accounting standpoint, if you don't collect the money, then you're going to have to reverse the accrual, right, et cetera, if you recognize it. But that's the value that we're looking for. It's the activity that you generate during that time period minus the cost to generate that activity, which is the profit.
And that makes total sense, because eventually you'll have an AR that's just huge versus your cash as it slowly flows in. That makes total sense. So to see the true value of a site, you'd end up going accrual instead of looking at cash, which is more of a consequence of your AR.
Correct.
And I know, Devora, you said something just now about switching to accrual-based accounting and getting that person who knows what they're doing to help. And I think that was something that Carlos and Devora both hit really hard. My favorite quote from Carlos was, "Hey, you get what you pay for." because so many times professionals are selected for things like acquisitions. Like you had said, Carlos, my uncle, he's a lawyer in real estate or something like that. So I wonder, from both of your perspectives, what do you think is the cost of working with professionals who do not have experience in this?
Well, in my experience, I went down that road where I had somebody that didn't actually know, first of all, like what research was in general, trying to do accounting on what we're like, know the process. And this time around, I can tell you that I'm setting it up on accrual basis with the, accounting people and all of that, and setting everything up the right way, or not necessarily the right way, because cash is not the wrong way. It's just harder whenever you're going to sell. And it gives you more visibility, I guess, on like where you're at in building of the company, or what your worth is too. And that's good to know all the way around before somebody like Alcanza is coming to buy you, that you can actually know where you stand and know kind of what your worth is. So
yeah, and maybe a little more confidence when you're approaching like someone who wants to buy your site and saying, they kind of like, oh, this. So Carlos, how do you feel if you had two sites coming in front of you, said, hey, I was thinking about just buying my site, and that's all they say, versus, hey, I was thinking about buying my site. Here's my calculated EBITDA. Here's my trial mix. Here's I have all my ducks in a row. Everything's done. I'm already accrual-based accounting. So when it comes to working with those two types of sites, how do you, as someone who purchases sites, how do you feel about that?
Well, the second one, I would pinch myself and see, am I awake?
Is this a unicorn?
Yeah, no, it's to us, that would be music to our ears, because what it means is the site has an infrastructure or systems and processes in place to kind of speak the language that we're going to have to speak ultimately to consummate a transaction, and it saves everybody time. And going back to your comment about the cost of getting advisors that are not suited for this, it costs everybody time and money. So the seller will probably, and I've seen it time and time again, where you go with somebody lower cost, hourly rate, but they bill more hours, right? Number one, that could be a real risk. And the other part is you go round and round. So it not only costs them money, it costs the buyers money and our attorneys too. I don't want to tell you how some of our final professional fees add up to be, and then you scratch your head and you're like, we could have gotten this deal done 30 days earlier. Sometimes the delays, you have to shift gears, and then they end up switching professional advisors, and so that's where
start all over again.
And that knowledge transfer. So it's happened in the 12 transactions we've done. Just in those 12, I've seen a little bit of all of this that I've mentioned before that. Again, nothing new. It keeps happening.
Wow. And I did want to go back to you, Carlos, because I forgot to have the follow-up question with you. But as you were listening to this podcast, did you have any connections, any alignments, anything with Devora as you were listening to her interview versus yours?
No, I actually did. And so one of the things I love to do I do it before and after a transaction. Before is, what are your goals and objectives? And after a transaction, what went well, what didn't go well, what could we do different or have done differently? And so a lot of the things Devora mentioned is, I've heard those, so there it's very, it resonated with me, and it brought back memories, and I could say, oh, so-and-so said this and that. And so everybody that goes through that experience, Devora will be firsthand to tell you, a lot of sleepless nights, burning the midnight oil quite a bit, and you got to do that while you're running your business, right? So the more you can do in advance, the better. So hearing Devora describe the situation, the process before and after, it just, it really reaffirmed how much you have to do upfront as both buyer and seller during the process and even after the process. Because, by the way, consummating the deal, that's just the beginning. It's not the end.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And Devora was talking about that too. Sometimes with these site sales, you sell your site, you sell your business, and then there's a second sale later in the event that your equity goes, or the PE firm sells that network. Then you have an opportunity to gain more money from that second sale.
Yep.
So it's almost like a double, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how's that going for you, Devora?
Not so great for me.
Not yet. Not so great. Well,
Nope.
we're second time around though.
Yeah.
Second time around. So I did want to touch on something that you both have also looked at in what you did, and that's the process. So we talked about professionals. Professionals absolutely have to have great professionals. We talked about being prepared, being that site that knows what you're doing. If you're going to sell, make sure you're on the track right now. But I wonder, from back to forth, from Carlos to Devora, we also found some similarities. I lost my train of thought. I apologize. Maybe that would be the question: is what, Devora, you mentioned multiple alignments. What alignments did you, they're like, oh yeah, that's what I said too. Did you have any alignments like that?
He talked about like I'd have to re-listen to it again, even though I just finished listening to it. there was, you know, it was like the way that he talked about like how the transaction kind of went, and knowing who you're going in with beforehand, like breaking the bread and that kind of stuff. I think that's super important to know who you're getting working with, and because it's going to be a long-term transaction, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
That was my one of my favorite Carlos quotes is, it's amazing what breaking bread can do, how you can learn about someone. In fact, I think I've broken bread with you, Carlos. It was a great conversation, and you learn so much when you are like everyone has to eat. Maybe that's what it is. Everyone has to eat. So you have something in common. You're sitting there breaking bread, eating together.
Yeah.
You start to talk about things. You start to really know that person. So first of all, I mean, I guess, Carlos, when you break bread, when you handshake someone, look at them in the eye, learn what kind of a professional they are, learn what they value, learn their objectives, their passions. What are the things that you look for in a positive partner versus someone like, maybe this isn't a good fit. I don't know about this. My gut check is telling me maybe no.
So that's a very interesting question, and I'll answer it in that there's two sides. What the person tells you one-on-one, which I value tremendously, because we'll be working together one-on-one as partners going forward. But it's also how they interact with their team, and their team interacts with them. And I've seen situations where I'll meet somebody individually, usually happens, offsite, super secret meetings so that the rest of the team doesn't know this is going on. And then you come on site and you see the interactions between the team members and the seller. And there's a little dissonance there, or it's just something doesn't feel right. Little examples, company's not that big and they're going around and not introducing somebody by their name. And the person is, at the sites, they're not very open and engaging. They kind of walk away from you instead of that. There's, on the opposite side, I've been to sites where they introduce, hi, this is Carlos. He has been with us for 6 or 7 years, and he does this. He's a superstar here. And, this is Devora on this. And you just get a different feel when you're walking through. And at the end of the day, you're not buying brick and mortar and equipment. You're buying a collection of, I'll say, assets, with the biggest one being the people. They're the ones who make the magic happen every single day. And so you got to look at the collective. So it's the individual one-on-one plus the interaction with all of the folks. And that's why, to me, the earlier I can meet the person one-on-one live, and the earlier I can get through the site to just get a feel, even as a consultant or et cetera. But it's kind of hard to go covert these days, because everybody looks up your name, immediately knows who you are. But it's really important. So that's how I make sort of my decision, upfront. I'll say, I'll develop a game plan to say, okay, what else do I need to look at?
And do you ever run into a situation where you have one-on-ones with someone? Do you ever have one-on-ones with the employees without the other person present to see kind of
that rarely happens until you go into official, real hard, fast due diligence. And even then, it's it might be interactions, but I prefer transparent. And I mean, I've had situations where employees will reach out to me after the fact and say, "I'd like to talk to you one-on-one." I'm like, "Oh, okay."
Oh, okay.
I don't, but that's a telltale sign.
Interesting.
So yeah, you learn a lot through live interactions
Hmm.
for sure.
Yeah.
And from a site's perspective, Devora, like when you do the live interactions with people who want to buy your site, what are the things that are good flags and spidey sense kind of gut checks when you talk with those groups?
I think it is figuring out what the culture is going to be with the new company and where they stand. I know for us that, it's very relationship driven. And I know on the last acquisition and the one I'm sure that I will have in the next couple of years will also be the same thing, to make sure that the culture from both organizations align, and that, that we can have an actual relationship and build a relationship, and that the people that are be coming in would be able to build a relationship with the staff that we have. So
Mhm.
I think that's super important and will be important, going forward.
Mhm. And you especially pointed out the PIs or the investigators or the physicians that you're working with
Yeah.
and that transition.
Yeah. So I,
How did that work?
I think for sure, like the PIs need, for one, they need to kind of know that this is a potential, going into it. They don't need to be blindsided, in my opinion. Like they need to have a buy-in, because it makes the transaction much smoother if they know what's going to be happening soon, um, and um, and then also kind of hearing their, like what their concerns are, and making sure that they're an integral part of making decisions going forward with whoever you're going to be partnering with.
Hmm. So you mean like even when you start a company, if you have a plan to sell in the very beginning, let the PI know, hey, we have an exit strategy. At some point,
Yeah, and
we are.
and most people right now are not going to have that. I mean, I do because it's number two, but
Mhm.
most sites don't have that in the back of their mind that, oh yeah, we're going to sell. So I think it would be a good idea to start having like a planning meeting or planning for the future with the team to kind of give them what the long-term goals of the company are. And if acquisition is going to be that, getting your team ready for that, because that's a really hard pill to swallow, whenever it's, oh, here we
Mhm.
are today, and then we're Alcanza tomorrow. So
And so, Carlos, on the Alcanza side, when you come into a community, when you acquire a site,
Mhm.
how is that relationship with physicians and PIs? How does that transition occur like smoothly? Are there any ways to help with that?
Yeah, well, first of all, one of the things that we believe in is to maintain the local brand. That brand has been built over a tremendous amount of time by every single one of the people at that site. And so we
Mhm.
maintain that brand. They just become an Alcanza clinical company. And we can explain the relationship from a business perspective, the sponsor, CROs, partners, et cetera, but to the patients and employees, that brand means a lot.
Mhm.
So technically, I always say this with a little bit of tongue in cheek. When you come in the next day after the transaction closes, people think all this is going to change, and I tell them, "What did you see change?" And most people, nothing. Exactly,
Mhm.
business as usual. And then we put our heads together to actually put a sort of integration transition plan that makes sense for what's going on at the site, what site needs exist, the priority difference, et cetera. So it's a collaboration, it's a partnership. The last thing you want to do is come in day one and impose all these changes that are going to, I'll say, negatively impact the very value that the site created and that you just bought, right? And
Mhm.
so again, it goes back to a partnership. So you get around and you start again meeting everybody that you didn't meet, and truly understand the roles and responsibilities. And now sort of the cat's out of the bag. Everybody knows something happened. You
Mhm.
want to make sure people understand what happens, what are the changes that may happen right away, i.e., where is the check going to come from, right? And the benefits, people's comp and benefits, you want to make sure people are very comfortable that that's going to continue. So it's just putting people at ease, right? Again, these are human beings, and you want to make sure that they're at ease, because if they're not at ease, they're going to be talking about this, worrying about this, and if they're doing that, they're not going to be taking care of their patients.
Wow. And so that brings me Devora, when your site sold, what were, and I guess I should premise, I used to work at a company, a very small company. They were really successful, so successful, a giant company came in and bought them. So I was like employee number one of the new flag, of the new banner. So I've personally witnessed like transitions and acquisitions and kind of like the changing of the guard and things like that. So for your site, and I'm sure when you walked in day one, not much has changed, but what was the progression of change that you had, and what was there an order or a process in which it occurred?
So I was the first acquisition of the last one that I was. So they were just trying to get processes and stuff going. So I probably am not the best person to answer that, but I can probably say, like for sure nothing changes right away. But like Carlos mentioned, like pay and comp and where the paychecks come from, that kind of stuff. And then eventually it would go into like centralized teams and who's going to take care of, what on, and it normally starts from the top, right? From the top down, as far as, finance and stuff would probably be moved up first. And the things that a normal coordinator, recruiter, all those people that are like on the front lines don't necessarily see and shouldn't fill right away.
That makes sense. So finance, contract, obviously this is a business. So as a new owner, the business will start to get a hold of finance and contracts ASAP. Carlos, you also mentioned that for any trial that is active, you're going to have to contact the sponsor and say, hey, we need to have an amendment to the contract. There's a new owner. Is that how that works?
It depends on the details of the contract, right? If the contract requires consent for assignment or just notice of change of control. So yeah, we have to, and that's part of the due diligence. So up front what contract actions you're going to have to take, some before closing, some after closing. But yeah, there's a lot of activities that, again, we know before closing. But what Devora is talking about, of all the centralization, you kind of go department by department. How do we start supporting from a finance standpoint, from an HR standpoint? Some things happen pre-close, but they can't really take effect until after close, right? Because closings get delayed, they could get canceled, et cetera. But there's a lot of moving parts. So there's got to be a lot of communication. We like to have standing meetings, just status updates. Where is this? Where is that? So everybody is aware of the moving parts, and some things get delayed, some things we can do faster. And again, as I said earlier, I think part of the planning is what should be the sequence of things depending on the needs of the site. Some are more immediate than others.
For example, if a site isn't running off of a CTMS, if they're paper site, and you're like, hey, we use a CTMS, we got to figure out how to onboard them into the CTMS system, maybe get new electronic systems in place, maybe do an SOP on electronic data verification, validation, safety, security, cyber, everything. So that site who doesn't have electronic presence, they're probably going to need a little more care and customization in that versus a site that is much more technical.
Correct.
Okay, perfect. And speaking of which, so we know a lot of the infrastructure, finance, HR. What about technology? How does the technology how does that work when it comes to bringing a site into a network?
So I think for us, what we do is we kind of put it into two buckets. We put sort of non-clinical systems, right? For example, your email system, telephony, your finance system, your HRIS system, et cetera. So we separate those two because we think the clinical system integration part is a lot more delicate in the sense that you don't want to impact what's going on in the clinic. We also don't want to impact all the other groups, but what I'm saying,
Mhm.
it's a little bit different, right? You can take the approach, you can bring in outside support to help, and the goal is, again, to figure out what is the sequence of events so that we can start closing the books, start paying bills, start generating invoices from an HR perspective, payroll, insurance, all of those components. And then there's the email system, telephone systems. Again, all of that sort of migration too to take some time, because you're going to be bringing everybody under the same sort of umbrella so that we can start collaborating on email, Teams, calling each other a lot more easily as if we are the same company, right? That you have become. But again, all of this takes time. It's really dependent on what state or at what stage the site is at for each one of these areas.
Mm-hmm. And maybe to Devora, this is your second time around, and Carlos, I'd love for you to chime in. But if any site is considering selling right now, what kind of tech stack would you prefer when it comes to acquisition? Tech stack being everything from like accounting software to all the way through anything like that. I'm not saying like plug actual names, but of companies. But what, like, if you look at, what do you think would have helped you as a site if you had this tech stack and you were going through the process, or as a buyer, what tech stack would you look at saying, okay, cool, this is going to be a great transition?
I'll let Devora go first.
I think there's so many different vendors that I think obviously you need to have some sort of a CTMS type system. I think that's going to be helpful for the wholesale process in general, for everybody to do due diligence. And then, if you can be as not as much tech as you can, but I think it's easier to maybe, and I could be wrong, and Carlos, you can chime in, but it could be easier to integrate some things nowadays than it has been, as far as like phone numbers and things like that. Email addresses are not as hard to integrate anymore, but try to be with the times, I guess, as much as you possibly can, as far as transferring data over, because it's really difficult to re-upload a lot of paper files. It just gets kind of hairy, I would think. Yeah.
What do you think, Carlos?
So I think for us on the clinical side, I'm not going to lie. If you have no systems, it's actually easier to integrate because you're not migrating anything. We've gone through migrations from every system under the sun. They're all equally challenging, and they take time and planning and time again and resources. So on the non-clinical side, most companies, for example, have a financial system. As long as we can pull the data out, it's okay. I mean, we use a more sophisticated system. We actually wouldn't expect another company to have that. It's interesting on email and telephony. It would be helpful if everybody just had Office 365, because then the transfer would be a heck of a lot easier. We've come across where people have local phone systems. They have Gmail backed up to a home account, all sorts of things.
Oh, wow.
And that's okay. I mean, we go in, we assess. It's part of the process. But you asked, if we were to have an ideal situation, then that's what we would.
Not asking too much. I mean, getting a 365 account isn't bad. That's
and also licensing, right? Licensing information, because what we do is we find over time, seeing that you don't necessarily have all the licensing information, so you got to track it down. If you don't have it, you got to buy new to make sure you're compliant. And even, by the way, I'll even say, even if it's the same system on the clinical side, same CTMS, it still doesn't. You still have to migrate the instances together. You can pull the data faster, earlier through an outside tool, but so even the same systems are not a done deal, because they may have been set up differently, configured differently to your process. So sometimes no system on the clinical side is better than
sometimes
any
just
system
you're going to end up starting from scratch, so you may as well just start from scratch anyway.
And some
Interesting.
companies, by the way, have said, I'm about to make a decision, but I'm holding off because I'm thinking of selling. And I two things I tell them. I'm like, well, that's a great idea from a buyer's perspective, but I always say you should make the decisions for your business as if you're going to keep running it, because you never know. Are you going to find the right buyer? How long it's going to take? So always think for the long term.
And I wonder, and I've run into this, sites often have to use a lot of sponsor tech, whether it's payment portals or or anything like that. What methods do you use to gain access to that? Because sometimes that gets really tricky if you got to get sponsor approval to get new access for things.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, with the assignments and things like that, it's going to take time, like Carlos said, regardless. But your payment people would have to be making those emails and getting the right people access. Just like if you're going to be adding coordinators or you had turnover, whatever, same deal.
Same exact process. It could take some time though.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've had to wait 6 months for payment portal access before, only because the sponsor never responded. We had to wait. So it can take time.
And that's not a priority to them like it is to you. So, yeah.
And I've run into that. And I wonder, okay, so we've got about 18 minutes left, and this is the meat and potatoes of the entire talk. But the number one thing that I saw in residence was we've got to let sites become aware and educate and try to be as preventative as possible when it comes to getting them ready for acquisitions. If they want to do acquisitions, that's number one, is prevention and awareness. So I wanted to take the rest of the time to ask both of you just that. How would you communicate this to sites, and what would you communicate?
About prevention and being ready? Is that
prevention and awareness? Yeah. So how would you, by prevention, I mean like prevention of problems, maybe. How could you be proactive about selling your site? Like what, and how can we get to the sites? How can we reach to them to inform them that this information is here and that it's meant to help them?
Well, I think one, we have to keep doing outreach constantly, reminding people, if you're thinking about selling, don't wait until you're ready to sell, because you're not going to be ready. Right? You need to start planning, ideally almost a year in advance at a minimum, just to make sure you have all your ducks in a row, because then you can do it without disrupting your business. And if it takes you more, then take your time, because you could create more value in the meantime for your business, right? So I think you need to make sure you have get the right advice. Don't assume that you know everything. Seek out either people who have done it, like Devora, for example. Get an advisor later. Once you've talked to enough people that have done it, then if you're ready for that, then get the professional advice that you need to get your ducks in a row across the board, right? So that you can go into this process understanding what it's going to take you to do, cost-wise, time-wise, and the resources that it's going to draw. Because oftentimes that's what we see the most is a company has the resources to run the business, but not to sell the business. And so that's always it's a struggle.
Yeah. I mean, we get ready for FDA audits and sponsor audits and all the things like that. It's not the same, but kind of the same. You should kind of always have in your mind that anybody could be bought on any given day, and try to always be ready. So setting yourself up for success, there's reasons why private equity and bigger groups do things the way that they do, is because they're able to scale on a dime. And so their infrastructure and the way that they're set up is help. Like if you can follow how they're set up as far as, structure wise, and the accounting and things like that too. You'll be more valuable. And for two, you'll be, kind of in the know on how things are going to go whenever you are sold. So.
And you just said a trigger word that reminded me of your interview, Devora. You used the word scale a few times in a very interesting way. And I wonder, I guess when I heard you say that, the question was, at what point in the scaling process do you feel you have an optimal justification to sell your site? Like, when do you know, like, okay, we're scaled, this is good, this is probably something we need to start pursuing now?
I mean, everybody's going to have their own number, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of look at what your EBITDA is, and if you have that number and what the multiple is going out in the market right now, if you multiply that by what your EBITDA is and you're happy with that take home, then that's when you go.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, not necessarily EBITDA or value, but at what point in the stage of the site, like number of sites in your network, or if you have an HR department, or is there any kind of a
I
trigger
don't
where
think
you're
that
like,
there's like a trigger. Like you can have one site that does phenomenal and you're not necessarily scaled because you have one, but you're happy with that. Or you could, scale to 10 or whatever somebody is, but it's still relative to what you want in life and what you're willing to exit at. So
mm-hmm. Carlos, what do you think from your experience? The average site that approaches you, and I think you even said you talked to some sites saying, maybe come back in a year when this has happened.
Yeah.
What is it from a site's perspective, from your view, that you're like, okay, I think they're ready to be sold?
So a couple things. It's I'll say consistent or continued performance. So not a big spike and then back down.
Yep.
We saw that a little bit from post-COVID, right? There was a lot of COVID surge in activity. So I think the COVID burn-off has
Mm-hmm.
kind of, it's behind us. So that was one. I think if they're in the process, they just made an investment in extra space and they're nowhere near filling it. And if the valuation sort of expectations is I should be getting this because I can grow that much more.
Mm-hmm.
And if you believe you can do that, then do it, right?
Yeah.
I think
do it, then come back and you got to demonstrate.
And some
this
folks
isn't
have
pretend money, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
maybe future money, but it's not pretend money.
Yeah. So some folks have done a good job at that. Others have come back later and there's been no change, right? So so it's good on both sides to sometimes wait and not rush into things. I also think the right time too. It's not. I think it's less of an issue if you don't have an HR team or an IT team or a finance team. But think about the key aspects of a business. Key man risk, right? If the owner is the owner and the main PI and the business development person, that's pretty risky, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I would say don't go to market yet. Fix that, address it by bringing in other resources and make that investment because it will pay off in the long run.
Mm-hmm.
If you're at capacity completely and you're not, the profitability is not that high, well, work on your profitability. So there's different things, and like Devora said, it depends on the business. But I would look at to see if you were buying this business today, and the sellers know better than the buyers. What are the risks to the business? What's
Mm-hmm.
keeping you up at night? And the chances are you're going to have to address it during due diligence. So see what you can do before you go to market.
Yep. And I love the idea of planned redundancy, especially in some of the single site, single owner capacity where you've got to be sure that the organization is self-sustainable. Like if someone, wins the lottery and doesn't show up anymore, you're still running. You can't just be dependent on a single person. And I know we've got a little bit of time, but I wonder, Carlos, for all those sites out there who are wondering, like, how should I not try to build my site to sell? In other words, there are processes that sites do where they try to like pad the numbers when it's not necessarily real. Do you ever run into a situation where sites are like, hey, look at our EBITDA, it's great, and then you realize they just accepted a bunch of trials and they have no intention of enrolling in them? Mm-hmm. They're just living off of startup money. Anything where it's pseudo deceitful to the buyer and you're like, I know this trick and I understand what's happening.
Sure. I think, look, two things. One, the buyer has the role and responsibility to maximize their return on their, the seller does, right? Maximize the return on their business. The buyer has a responsibility to do their due diligence, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is sometimes happening when somebody tries to build a business fast to sell it, you do see things like all these trials that have been accepted, right? It could be in the early stages. So you do want to look at, well, what's the history? What's the history behind this therapeutic area experience? How often have they done it? How well have they done? And if you all of a sudden see a whole bunch of new trials in a therapeutic area that they didn't touch
Brand
before,
new.
didn't play before, then that should be at least taken into consideration about what's going to be the likely performance going forward on those particular trials. That's one. I think others is just the compensation. Sometimes we run into where owners give themselves really low compensation, and it's for tax purposes. We get it, right? But you have to make the EBITDA adjustments on that, because if we were to hire them commercially today and have to pay them more, right? So those are things where you have to dig into the EBITDA. That's why you do an analysis, and you need to make sure that you know the numbers.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about that, Devora? Methods to and not to use to enhance the value of your site?
Well, a couple of things that he said, like for the owners, definitely give yourself a livable wage, and don't do it too low and don't do it too high, because it definitely can hurt the EBITDA, or you just have to kind of back it in or back it out or whatever. And you definitely need to have some sort of a track record with what you're working on, whether it be therapeutic area or term with the PIs or whatever. And another thing is like what you said before, where like there's a doctor that's trying to be BD and the PI and the coordinator all at one time. It's impossible to wear 100 hats. And I think that's where site owners and site people try to do as much as they possibly can. And if they make that quote unquote investment on people, they'll see their company grow faster than what they had thought that they would, because you just can't be everything for everybody. So it's a hard lesson to learn, but it's one that needs to be learned. And that's part of the reason why people are wanting to sell, because they're tired of wearing all those hats.
I run into that too. I'm not cut out for this. I'd rather be a wolf in the pack versus a lone wolf. I just don't want to do this anymore. The same thing. And I love that analogy. So Carlos, you were saying, sometimes people don't take salaries to help with their EBITDA, but then just also what Devora was saying on the same exact thing. If you wear multiple hats, you're not hiring people you should be hiring, and that's likely going to be an adjustment. So you may as well try to get the infrastructure in place, the bandwidth in place to match your, and that is the alignment that's a little tricky to do.
Yep.
So perfect. We are at 54 minutes. I think that we're going to go and wrap this up. Amazing conversation. So if I were to hand either of you the microphone right now, and I said, what would you like to tell the community out here about acquisitions, either as a site or as a buyer, and how we can really just make it better for everyone? What would you tell them? We'll start with Devora.
I would tell them, like we talked about before, to get some counsel or at least some advising, and well in advance of whenever you're really wanting to sell. Get your kind of ducks in order, and and to not sell yourself short, because what you do is real important. So,
and the more prepared you are, the more confident you will be in your value, likely.
Yes, absolutely.
Carlos, what about you?
Yeah, well, I think I would say definitely prepare, but I would also say triangulate, get multiple sources of feedback even before you engage professional advisors and start spending money. just triangulate what's happening in the marketplace. Talk to people who have done it. Talk to people who have started to and haven't done it yet because they're at a different stage, right? And how do they prepare? Learn from that, and then choose the right advisors afterwards. Make sure that you make that investment because it will pay off in dividends. Because if you don't, it's going to not only have a different outcome result, but it could impact your ongoing business today, and that would be really, really bad.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like definitely preparation, seeking advice before you act, like making sure that you have the proper guidance and counsel, and a lot of communication, really. Communication between internal and external people. I've also
Agreed.
learned just from what I've seen in the whole acquisition world, and let's face it, we're throwing pretty substantial amounts of money around right now. And oftentimes, from my experience, money tends to bring out either the best or the worst in us. And so, as you see these dollars flying around and these egos that are working with these dollars, don't be a jerk. That's my number one rule. Don't be a jerk. We're all in here to accomplish something, but if you are not a respectable professional throughout this period, if you're aggressive for the wrong reasons, you've only complicated the entire scenario more than anyone ever needs. It's an artificial barrier that can be prevented with
and very telling telling of what you're about to get into.
Very telling. There's that break bread. If you those people, they can succeed, but at a cost, and that cost will be much more than what they're going to be paid. So, all right, awesome. So, Carlos, Devora, thank you so much for coming on to CRPN Central today. It was an honor, an amazing interview, and as I said, it's hard to find this information. So, if you see this video, if you find it helpful, please subscribe to CRPN Central. There's a lot of really cool content on there specific to clinical research. I hope you'll learn a lot. That's my objective. Carlos, Devora, thank you so much. All right, we'll talk to you guys soon.
Take care, Dr. Fox. Good to see you, Devora.
Yeah, good
Take
to
care,
see
everyone.
you. See ya.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.